In this video, I am in chapter 24 of Job. We'll be looking at Job's continued reply to Eliphaz. We saw his first reply, or the first part of his reply, in chapter 23. And now we're going to continue in verses 1 to 25 of chapter 24. So as we begin verse 1, and I'm going to try to hold this to 15 minutes. Vaya'an Iyov vayomer. And Job answered and said, Gam hayom meri sichi, yadi kavada al anchati. Indeed, today my complaint is bitter. My hand is heavy because of my groaning. As we look at this verse, we're going to see a continued reply that Job is going to make. And he's saying that basically because of his groaning, and I'm just sort of reviewing verse 1 of chapter 23. He laid out his complaint. Now, as we come to chapter 24, he's going to continue his reply. And so it reads, Madua mishadai lo nimsanu itim. Vayadu'u lo hazu yamav. Why are times not hidden by the Almighty? And why do we not know him? Why do not, they know him that see his days? Actually, they do not know him who see his days. One of the questions that Job is asking is simply, why is it that since times of punishment are not hidden from God, his true worshipers do not see his vengeance on the wicked? Job does not deny that God set a time for punishing the wicked, but he wishes that all might be able to see it come to pass. And so he then gives examples of what the wicked are doing, their evil acts, and they don't appear to be punished at all in verses 2 to 24. So verse 2, Gevulot yasigu, Eder gazulu vayiru. They are those that remove landmarks. They violently take away flocks, steal flocks, and feed them. And so what Job is talking about here, landmarks would be markers which divided one's property from another. And it was a serious crime to try to add to one's property by removing the landmark maker or marker. We see this, for example, in Deuteronomy 19. Deuteronomy 19:14 and Proverbs 22:28. There are those, Job is arguing, who remove landmarks and violently steal another's flock without experiencing God's righteous judgment. So again, he's going back to the problem that the righteous suffer, but the wicked often do not. So he continues to drive home what the wicked do. Hamor yetomim yenhagu. They drive away the ass, or the ass of the fatherless. They drive away. Yachbelu shur almanah. And the ox they take, the widow's ox, the ox of the widow, they take for a pledge. They take for a pledge the ox of the widow, Job is saying. The wicked take away the only ass of the orphan, and they take the widow's ox for a pledge from a debt owed them. They thus leave these helpless and deprived people without sustenance to maintain themselves and without God's apparent intervention. This is the point that Job is making. And so, where is God? He's saying in this, Yatu evyonim midarak. They turn away the needy out of the way, or literally, they turn the needy from the way. Yachad huvru anive aret. And so, together, the poor of the earth hide themselves or have been hidden as a result of what's going on. And so he's saying not only do they deprive the needy of justice due them, but the poor of the earth from these oppressors because they have to hide, because they fear they will be oppressed by them, because they feel the oppression. And so where is God? Again, is Job's argument. So in verses 5 to 8, he continues to explain the condition of those that are needy. And so in verse 5 it reads, Hein peraim bamidbar. Behold, as wild asses in the wilderness, Yatsu'u befo olam mishach hare la tarif. They go forth in their work and they seek diligently for their food. And as a result, they have to depend upon the desert. Arava lo lechem la arim. The desert then yields or gives to them bread for their children. And so what Job is saying here is that the poor are oppressed and they're like wild animals who live in the desert and never have an abundance of food. It'd be like we would think of homeless people today. They wander from place to place, finding what they can. All of their effort must be spent then in simply eking out a living. And the desolate desert is their source of sustenance. So not very promising, he's saying. And so he continues in verse 6 then. It reads, Ba sadeh belilo yik soru. They cut his provision in the field, and they spoil. V'cherem rasha yela keshu. That is, the vineyard of the wicked, they despoil, or they spoil. I guess we could say despoil the vineyard of the wicked. And as he continues here, the thought is the poor must pilfer, or I should say pilfer, from the vineyards of the wicked in order to subsist. These poor are outcasts who live on the provender intended for cattle, driven to steal by night and pilfer the late ripe fruit of the vines. And so he's describing what in his day would have been the homelessness of the poor. And so in verse 6 or verse 7, it reads, V'rom yalinu mibli levush. They lie all night without clothing. They lodge without clothing throughout the night. And ve'ein kesut ba'kara, and have no covering for the cold. And notice again, he's describing their condition. Frost is not uncommon in the desert. The days are scorching and the nights extremely cold. Since the wicked have possibly kept their outer garments as security, the poor have no protection from the cold. They must sleep without covering, as the word naked is often used to indicate the lack of outer garment. And so in verse 8, we continue, they are then wet because of the showers of the mountain. Muzeraf harim yirtavu, that is, from the showers of the mountain, they are wet because of being outdoors, and embrace the rock for their shelter. Umibli makseh havaku sur, that is, for their shelter, from their shelter, they embrace the rock. I'm sorry, they embrace the rock because of lack of shelter, from being without shelter, literally. Mibli makseh hivaku sur. They then embrace the rock. And Job is simply saying their only refuge where they can stay are caves in the mountains, since they have been driven away from their land and their homes. In their wandering, they are then wet with the rain showers of the mountains, describing the miserable condition of those that are in this state. And furthermore, they are that pluck the fatherless from the breast. Yigzalu mishod yatom. They like pluck the orphans from the breast and take a pledge for the poor. Va'al ani yakbolu. It is assumed that these are the widows, possibly, of verse 3. Their children are kidnapped and sold as slaves by the wicked. And they take as pledge, knowing that the poor are desperate for food, the wicked can dictate any terms that they desire in exchange for the necessities of life, and will often take clothing as a pledge. So as a result of such treatment, the victims of the ruthless go about without the necessary clothing, outer clothing of a covering for them. Notice verse 10, in verse 11 then, but verse 10 reads, Arum, hulahu beli levush. In other words, the result is they go about without clothing, Job is saying. And they are hungry, and they carry their sheaves. Ure evim nasu'u omer. As a result of such treatment, the victims of the ruthless go about without their outer clothing as a covering. They also make the poor work in their fields, but refuse them the right to eat any of the produce they are harvesting. They treat them worse than they would their own oxen. And of course, this goes against the teaching of the Lord in the book of Deuteronomy. Let me just stop here. I want to keep working through this chapter slowly, but I don't want to go real long. So if I do about 10 verses, possibly at a time, I'm able to cover them and get through them in a reasonable time. As I read this, my mind was thinking of a story I heard about on, it was on actually my Facebook page. It had to do with a street person who was bearded and not well at all. And a lady came up to him and said, "Sir, let me get you a hot cup of coffee." And he said, "No, just leave me alone." She said, "No, I'd like to get you a hot cup of coffee." And as it happened, she finally talked him into going into like a cafeteria close by. The lady was very wealthy looking. So they went inside, and she asked for a place toward the back of the restaurant or cafeteria. The owner became upset, and he said, "You can't bring him in here. This will bother my business." And it was an interesting video. The lady said, "Do you know the Eddy Corporation?" And he said, "Well, oh yeah, it's down the road. I basically take a lot of their CEOs and feed them." And she said, "Well, let me tell you, I'm the president of that company. My name is Eddie, and I want this gentleman to have a cup of coffee." And so, to make a long story short, he did get the cup of coffee. And she began to talk to this street person and said something like this: "When I was out of college, I was poor. I was struggling. And I think you were the one that invited me in a cafeteria, and you made this wonderful sandwich for me. I can tell by looking into your eyes that you were the same person. And I never forgot that. And I want you to know that you can go to my company anytime. I will talk with the CEOs, and whatever you need, they will give you." That story moved me as I read it. And it went on to conclude where the lady said, "My life has been changed by Jesus Christ. He has done something to me that was supernatural by my accepting him as Lord and Savior. And I'm so happy to serve others that struggle in life like I had." I thought that was a powerful story. And as I read a text like this, Job is contrasting someone like that with those that are very hurtful to the poor of his day and treating them like they're not even treating them almost as better or worse than they would treat their animals. And so Job, his argument is, where is God in all of this? And of course, uh, one of the things that the book of Job wrestles with is, how do we explain bad things in a world and that we have a good God? And as Job comes to the end of the book, he will answer that God, we can't understand all of God's sovereignty, but we know he is still sovereign. And the thinking of his friends are completely off base, which was, if you're not, if you were righteous, Job, God would take care of you. And the point he's trying to make here is that sometimes in this world we can't explain what is happening from a human perspective. And so he's critiquing the theology of his friends. So I'm going to stop there, but we'll pick it up next time at verse 11.